Welcome to our Cbam webinar, a practical guide for business. During this time, I request everyone to be muted at this moment. We are recording this meeting and it will be sent to you after this session. At the end of the webinar, we will share a survey with you. Please fill it out and hand it over to us so that we can do better next time. And in case you have any questions or you want to give feedback or comments, you can write to us at compliance@apengineering.com. We'll get back to you within a couple of days. And we have a speaker and a dedicated sustainability expert today. We have Niranjan Ramasubramaniam, who is a sustainability expert. He will be there to answer your questions. And I'm Ranjini Varadarajan. I work as manager in the compliance division at APA. So a bit about ourselves before we just land into the webinar topic. So we provide customer-centric solutions and we have domain expertise with more than 22 years. And we have pioneering compliance solutions and advanced tool for process automation, data management, data analysis, and also reporting. Moving forward. And at APA Engineering, we are customer-centric and we give our hearts into pioneering innovation and also excel at the same time. As I said before, we have more than 22 plus years of experience. We are ISO and dissect certified, and we offer our services in 4 major divisions: compliance engineering, sourcing, and technology. And in compliance, we also offer compliance as a service. Then we also have great products with us as software, and also we provide turnkey solutions. Moving forward. And here are some of our compliances coverage as a whole. Due to the lack of time, we have an in-depth webinar, so I'm skipping to this. I'm skipping over to the next slide. Okay, this would be the agenda for today. So we'd have a brief introduction about Cbam, and then we'll look into the industries that are going to be affected by this regulation. Then we will look into what must be reported and how to get ready for reporting, in a sense that what businesses must actually do. And then we'll have a sample Cbam calculation presented. Moving over to the next slide. Okay, and we'll start with the introduction. All of us know how Cbam regulation started. It is a package of Fit for 55, where European Union wanted to reduce greenhouse gases by at least 55% by 2030, and that's how Cbam fits in the Fit for 55 package. And obviously, Cbam was is being introduced in such a way that the EU emission trading system will phase out, and slowly Cbam will start coming in instead. And so moving over. And so this is the objective of the Cbam. So we have 3 main objectives. One, you have to equalize the carbon price to plug carbon leakage. The second one is like encourage more greener production outside of EU. And the third one is to reinforce EU ETS. So this is what we were speaking about. So Cbam is designed in such a way so that when EU ETS free allowances phase out, and then Cbam will come in, and so we'd be given fair prices everywhere. So I'm just moving over to the next slide. And the Cbam regulation is going in phases. And the first is called the transitional phase. In the transitional phase, and then you have a Cbam review period, followed by the definitive phase. Your transition period has actually started. It's from October 2023, and we have the period ending by December 2025. And the review will begin in January 2025. And after a year, the definitive phase will start. So during the transitional period, we can see that there are certain provisions that are given by the EU, which will cover in the later sections. And then during the transitional phase, all of us are supposed to submit quarterly emissions reporting. And the good thing for now is that there are no financial adjustments. And during the review period, which begins by January 2025, you're going to have some scope extensions, because right now Cbam is covering certain sectors, only 6 sectors. and that scope will be extended, and they will also look into how to include indirect emissions as well, and what about the goods that are being exported. And the third is a definitive phase, which begins by January 2026, and it's supposed to continue later on. And here is where the EU ETS will slowly phase out. And this will become a yearly reporting. And here we'll have financial adjustments to be made, which means that we have to buy Cbam certificates, which is mandatory. Moving over. And I'm going to talk in some details about the transitional phase, because that's where we are in. So the entire period is from 2023 October to December of 2025. So here we have flexibilities. The first flexibility is that we have the default values. So EU has come up with the default values provision along with JRC, which will provide the default emission factor for operators and importers who can use this for complex good, because I think many operators may not have the embedded emissions for the precursors that they are including in the production process. So this is given in order to make their lives much easier. And the second thing, as said in the prior slide, we don't have any sort of financial adjustments right now. So Cbam certificates is purchasing of the certificates is optional. Then EU authorized importers are supposed to submit the Cbam report by 31st January 2024 for the data they have collected in the third quarter, which is from October to December of 2023. And this reporting will include both directed and indirected embedded greenhouse gas emissions, and all of them are all the goods that are covered in the scope of Annex 1 of the regulations will be in scope for transitional phase, and the GHG emissions also must be verified. Moving over. And in depth we can see what are the emissions that will be included. So you have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. So scope 1, you have the direct emissions that is generated by the production of any goods that are covered under the Annex 1. And then you also have your indirect, which is electricity, or the electricity that you're consuming to produce your good. And you also have indirect emissions, which is like any input material that comes under the Cbam scope, like any input material or a precursor, that's what we call. So that will also be included under the indirect emissions. So these are the emission scope that is covered, and the transition phase is set to end by December 2025. Moving over. So just to know, just to give a glance of what the direct and the indirect emissions mean, I've just put it out here. So we spoke about direct emissions, and the direct emissions which which happens when you're producing the goods in the manufacturing or the installation facility. It is not only those direct emissions. If you're using heating and cooling for that product, even if that location is set outside of the facility, that will also be considered as a direct emission in the transitional phase. And then the indirect emissions is all the electricity that is consumed during the production of the product. Moving over. So a little about the definitive phase. So from January 2026 onwards, we'll have the definitive phase set in. And so here is when EU ETS will be phased out. It will start from 2026, while slowly Cbam will creep in. And right now, EU ETS is capturing about 45% of the greenhouse gases emission, whereas 50% of the emissions covered in EU ETS will be captured by Cbam as it phases in slowly. So we also have all the European countries along with the Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein. So the emissions reporting will during the definitive phase will be for an entire year. Right now it's quarterly. They are doing this because they want to collect data. Probably that's the reason. And once the definitive phase sets in, it's going to be for an entire year. So if you're submitting for 2026 by 31st May, you have to report for the entire period, that is a year before. So you have to submit your 2025 yearly data. And also apart from that, EU importers must buy Cbam certificates and they also have to be, all the emissions that you are giving via the reporting must be verified by an accredited verifier in EU. And the Cbam certificates will be purchased by all those who need from the EU's national competent authorities. So this is a small diagram of what happens during the definitive phase. Since we've spoken about it, I'm moving over. And though we are in the transition phase, there are some considerations for non-conformance to Cbam regulations. So if we are not submitting Cbam regulatory reports on time, I think we will face penalties between 10 and 50 euros for 1 ton of embedded emissions during the transition period. And if you're also going to be penalized for excess of emissions, that is like if the main objective of Cbam is to make sure that there is no carbon leakage. So if you're going to given goods which are increasing in emissions, then you will be penalized by 100 euros per ton of carbon or carbon dioxide equivalent. So, and all the penalties will be decided by the member states. So though we are in the transition phase, it is the penalty is still applicable. Though there is no financial adjustment, the penalty alone is applicable right now. Moving over. So we are going to see what are the industries that are going to be affected by Cbam. So here are the 6 sectors covered. So any goods that come under the cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers, electricity and hydrogen, all these will be covered under the scope of Cbam for now. This is just in the transition phase. So during the review, which starts from Jan 2025, of course, there'll be a scope extension. And here's an example of the aggregated goods category and their product code and description which I have given. But I'm moving over due to the lack of time. And there are certain exceptions for Cbam. So if you're producing any goods for military activities and then importing into the EU, so you will be exempted from Cbam. Then all the 30 countries that are under EEA and EFTA, they are also exempted. And if you're going to import consignments with a value of less than 150 euros, then also you'll be exempted from Cbam. And then let us take a look into the people who are actually being affected. So there are 2 criteria. One is like EU importers of goods which are subjected to Cbam originating from a third country. They have obligation to report on Cbam. Then you also have non-EU producers who are exporting into EU. They are also responsible for monitoring and reporting all the embedded emissions. So we are going to go into what must be reported, and when we are seeing what must be reported, I think we have to focus more on the transition phase because that's where we are in right now. And during the transition phase, I've just given information on who must be actually reporting. So this reporting has to be done by an authorized Cbam declarant. So an authorized Cbam declarant is actually an EU importer. They have to apply for the status of a declarant through a Cbam registry, and then they will be accepted based on specific criteria. And there are things that must be reported in the transitional registry. So that is the information that we have down here. So what is the total quantity of each type of goods? What is the total embedded emission? That is the actuals. Then you also have to give an account of your total direct and indirect emissions and the carbon price due for embedded emissions. So though the transition phase does not mandate carbon price, I think EU has advised all of us to given the carbon price due from the country of origin, because they want to see how things move, or how much pricing we are paying based on each and every country of origin. So it is done for data collection, but it is not mandatory. So I'm moving over to the next slide. And because we were speaking about goods, so different goods can have different emission categories. I came in from that section to here because even before we move forward, we have to know whether CBAM is applicable to what sort of good. So there are certain goods like simple goods, complex good, and aggregated goods. So aggregate is a mixture of simple and complex good. So you have simple goods that are produced from input materials. They have zero embedded emissions. So example like center and blooms and all that. And you have complex good. Then they use input materials with embedded emissions. So they become complex. Example, you have steel tubes. Moving over. And just to give an idea about the definitive phase, this information is in, but the rest of the session will be on transitional phase only. So we have who must be reporting during the definitive phase, that is from 2026 onwards. It's going to be the authorized CBAM declarant, and here you will declare the total quantity, which is the same as in the transitional phase. Then you have to give your total embedded emissions. Then an accredited EU verifier must be able to verify all the emission information that you give. So that is very important in the definitive phase. And then the number of CBAM certificates that you purchase and you're going to surrender finally, and then the carbon price that you are paid in the country of origin. So this becomes mandatory. So purchasing of CBAM certificates and then the carbon price paid is going to become mandatory here. So then because if you have paid a carbon price, they will be able to financially make adjustments based on the number of CBAM certificates you are purchasing. Moving over to the next slide. So how are we getting ready to report? So this is a data requirement during the transitional phase. So there is a minimum data that is required. So you have to have your CBAM declarant authorized identification. So you need the name, then the CBAM account number. And you also have to have data on imported goods, which is type and quantity, and the country of origin, and you have actual emissions or default values. So this is with respect to the general information that is required, and this will be required in the transitional registry. So we will see about how to submit it to this transitional registry later, and I'm moving over. And in case if you're giving you actual emission data, then you also have to have information on identification of the installation, that is where your goods are being produced, that is the installation or the manufacturing facility. Then the contact information of the operator, that is who is actually running that installation. Then you also need verification reports, and you also have to give information on specific embedded emissions. Sorry. And the one thing that we saw was a data requirement for declarants. The other one is a data requirement for installers and operators. So these are the main focus people, because I think all the data needs to come from the operators to any business who's importing into the EU. And EU has provided us with a communications template which can be used. But there is no legal binding that we have to use a template. But overall, this is the information that needs to be gathered from the production or installation facilities. So you have the facility detail, you have the production process, you have the product details, which means the CN code. In the previous slide, I showed you a list of codes where you had aggregated goods, what it means for iron, what code it is, and the description and all that stuff. So you will have to give your CN code, what is the name of the product, and you have to report on specific embedded emissions, which is going to be direct and indirect. Then in the unit that you're measuring, and you also have your embedded electricity, so which is like you need to give that information as well, and carbon pricing related information, which is not mandatory during the transitional phase. Okay, and this is how we are saying that businesses should get ready. So first thing is like, please allocate responsibilities. So please identify your own departments or individuals who will be responsible for this. Then you also have to assess the impact. So suppose you are working with multiple facilities which provide you with a lot of goods, and finally you come up with a final product. You have to understand who will be applicable for reporting under Cbam. So you have to do an impact assessment, and you should also collaborate with the suppliers. The suppliers, in the sense here, we call them as facilities, or else the installations, or else the manufacturing units. We have to have a huge collaboration with them. You have to identify the gaps also. You have to consider direct and indirect emissions to know what you are actually missing. Then it is better to go digital. I don't think so Excel sheets would work, because it is tough getting all information from all units. I mean, your manufacturing units or installations, and maintaining them, it's going to get complex with like Excel and other work. And then you also have to set up a Cbam action plan. When we say action plan, it revolves around continuous monitoring, then auditing, and then validation of the reports internally and also externally. So in continuation, what are we trying to tell business owners is that you have to first provide awareness of Cbam regulation within your own organization. Then if you are an importer, then you have to register with the Cbam transitional registry, and you can be a declarant, or else you can act as a representative also. And then we have given you the links to access to the Cbam registry. It is possible only for importers and indirect custom representatives to be Cbam declarants. So they also have to register via their economic operators registration and identification. Only then you will get a EORI number. So only with this information you will be able to register into the Cbam transitional registry. In this presentation, we have provided all the data from where you need to go and log in, or else any other access information has been provided, which we will share with you. And third, in case you have any final manufacturing process, because Cbam is all about getting the emissions not only at the installation level, it is also at the product level. So you have, in case not only your manufacturing units provide you with goods, but you have a final manufacturing process which is involved right in your facility, then you should also, and if they fall under Annex 1, then you should request the internal employees of your organization to provide data. So sometimes we may go through three, four suppliers may be giving us information, but there may be a final process in your own organization where you may have a facility. In case you do that, you also have to collect data from them, and after that we have to provide support to the facilities or from whom we get all the products about the communications template, because they are supposed to give us information on the specific directed and indirect emissions, which is very, very crucial for getting the report ready. And once we suppose you're working with 100 manufacturing facilities, you have to aggregate all this data and then finally report on the same. And you can use a transition registry to go and do this declaration, or as they have also given us an XML file. You can upload your data via that, in that format, and then finally upload it into the transitional registry. So whatever suits your organization, either it can be just logging into the transitional registry and directly creating the data, or else if you find XML being really workable and easy, we take their format, we provide all the information, and finally upload it. And this is for the businesses. As an installation or an operator, First thing is like anybody whom we are working with. If you're a business owner who's like importing into EU, then you have to let your installations or operators know that they have to understand the reporting organized obligations. Sorry, as a manufacturer, they are supposed to provide the businesses with accurate information, or else the declarants with the accurate information. Then, in not only understanding whether you're falling into the scope of Cbam, and also you have to decide on your emission calculation methodology also, because there are different methodologies that are used in order for us to give specific embedded emissions, and those emissions are methodologies are listed below. So the first is EU reporting methodology. We have this in the Annex 4 of the Cbam regulation, which has been published by EU. We are going to see an example right from there. And then the second is the equivalent method. And the third one is different default reference values, which can be used until July 2024. And the default reference values for calculating specific embedded emissions for precursors have been published by EU with JRC. We also have provided links for the same. And the third is like you have to focus on continuous monitoring and measurement, because finally what happens is that the EU reporting methodology will be applicable, will be the only method applicable from January 2025. So and you can use only default values only if they are going to have, only if they're going to represent 20% of the total embedded emissions. So by nature, by default, from January 2025, all of us will have to resort to EU reporting methodology. So it is best to understand what is EU reporting methodology from first. And then the last one is like we have to provide information about the carbon pricing. Though it is not mandatory, we are EU encourages us to give the carbon pricing, and the carbon pricing could you have the information based on the country of origin and the type of carbon pricing system, then what is the value of the carbon pricing in euros. So you have to just convert and give the information, and the quantity of emissions covered, and are there any free allowances that they give you, or else are there any rebates that they're providing you. All this sort of carbon pricing information also has to be provided by the installer or operator, because we could be operating from multiple locations, multiple countries, we could have manufacturing facilities, so this makes sense. So moving over to the next slide. So here we see there are two basic methodologies that is in EU. We are going through all this because ultimately this counts. That's how all the businesses must get ready. So EU methodologies is clearly published in Annex 4. One is your calculation based methodology, and the other one is measurement. So anything related to calculation, it will involve measuring your greenhouse gases emissions right from the source and using activity data. Activity data is nothing but the volume of goods that you're producing in your manufacturing facility. And sometimes they can also contain additional factors obtained from standard values. They are available in Annex 8. This is mostly related to waste gases. And and the other methodology is your measurement based methodology, which comes from calculating emission sources by continuous measurement of your relevant greenhouse gases in the fuel. So there is not much information on measurement based methodology, but more details will come from EU in 2024. And here is a glimpse of your reporting requirements during the transition phase. So this is what we are focused on. So we have given you the reporting metrics, what it should be for the sectors, except electricity will be in NWH, and what are the emissions that is being covered. So for aluminium and fertilizers, you can see that you also have PFCs and also nitrous oxide covered. So, and excuse me, and we also have given the emission coverage during the transitional period. So electricity will always be direct, and the rest will be direct and indirect. And then the emission coverage during the definitive period, which is not of a huge criteria right now, because we are more concerned about transitional phase. And then how you determine your direct embedded emissions. and how you determine the indirect embedded emissions. And so right now we are going to see a small calculation sample, which is based on the EU methodology, which is like right from the first option that we saw, that is a calculation methodology, which is standard in the EU methodology, which is prescribed in Annex 4. So we are taking the example of iron and steel. All of us are aware that the EU has published in-depth webinars on each and every sector. And iron and steel will follow a different route, because finally products like steel will also contain embedded carbon emissions in the final product. So we go with a subtype called mass methodology for calculating the embedded emissions. Let me move over. So before we actually go down into the calculation process, there are certain how-tos that we should do before we jot down all the emission related figures. So first thing is, like, if you're going to be an installer or a manufacturer, because it's very important for them, and any businesses where production process is involved, it's going to be very important. Plus they have to fall under the scope of Cbam, and all those goods are in the Annex 1. So first is like define your system boundaries associated with the process. So you have to know your manufacturing process well, and in order for you to understand what may fall under the Cbam scope. Then you have to identify your parameters, your methods, and then you have to carry out your monitoring. Then you have to attribute emissions to the production process and then to the goods. So here with Cbam is that you don't only just take the goods, but you also attribute emissions to the entire production process. So, and the fourth is that you add the embedded specific emissions of relevant precursors. So these are the inputs that go into your production process. So we have to add the embedded emissions, and since most of them don't have the embedded emissions, specific emissions of precursors, that is where the default values come in. So this is going to be of great use. And the fifth one is like we have to determine the final embedded emission of the Cbam good. So there are three things here. So you know your manufacturing production process. So you have to define a boundary and see what is going to be applicable in the Cbam scope, because your manufacturing unit may be producing, say for example, 50 types of goods, and only 10 goods may be applicable in Cbam. So with the production process being mapped out, you will be able to identify what falls where, and if it is applicable for you to report on that. The second thing is like you have to identify your method, and then you have to understand how you want to monitor. The third is like, you know, attributing emissions, and even during attributing emissions, you are involving a lot of precursors into your manufacturing process. So that is where your defaulting will come in. I'm repeating the same. And final step is to determine the specific embedded emissions of Cbam goods. And here is an example that we have taken, that is the crude steel protection. So we are going by mass methodology method, which means during the final steel product by itself will contain embedded emission. So this is the right approach to take, and this is the right methodology. We are in the methodology that is prescribed in Annex 4. So here you can see how the production process is for a crude steel. So you have a production process 1. You also see that there are a lot of precursors like iron ore, steel scrap, coke going in to a sinter plant. And then you also have a blast furnace, which then you also, that is getting fed into a basic oxygen furnace. And what are the processes that they do? Cold rolling, hot rolling, and rail mill. And though I'm not very aware of manufacturing industry as a whole, you can see that one entire production process is involved, and you will be able to identify what inputs are going into your production process and what is your output. And then finally you also have your electricity, which comes from power. You can also generate your own electricity, or else you can purchase, and then you will also consume. So all these must be factored in and also monitored if you want to give out the right specific embedded emissions finally for your crude steel. So I'm moving over. And so this is what is meant by identifying. First, we drew a system boundary for the production process. So this is where I was in. That is like drawing system boundaries. And second thing is like you're identifying your parameters and you have to monitor them. So you have to, what are your parameters? So you have to identify your direct emission, which comes from fuels or any other materials, and then emissions that is related to heat flows. So you have to determine your heat flow, and you will also come up with the emissions for the heat flow based on the heat flow into the corresponding emission factor. And what are the precursors used? This is what I was talking about. They are substances used as a foundation in the manufacturing of a product. So whatever you're using as an input, even they may contain, please understand, they may contain zero embedded emission, which can be a simple good. A simple good can go into the manufacturing unit to become a complex good. So in simple goods, you will not have any embedded emission, so they will be just zero. But for the other goods, like suppose like sinter, or you may have an embedded emission, and then which finally will attribute to the total specific embedded emissions. So we have to know what goes in and also what comes out. And then what is the electricity that is being produced? Is there any electricity that is being produced? For example, some manufacturing units may convert waste gases into electricity, so that can also happen. And are there any, I mean, and what are the indirect emissions based on the electricity consumed during the production process, which also includes the electricity that is being used for the precursor, any operation on the precursor, also any inputs that go inside the manufacturing production process. And then waste gases produced. Obviously, when you are trying to manufacture items like steel, there will be a lot of waste gases, and these are the parameters that you have to identify after you draw your or map your system boundary. So I'm moving over to the next, which is which is to say what method we are using for calculation. This is a mass method, because we are going to have embedded carbon emission in the final product, which is steel. So how are we using this method is to determine all the carbon content in fuels and input materials. The second is to determine carbon content in all outputs. So input and then your output. Then we will determine the emission based on the differences between 1 and 2. So moving over. So this is the actual calculation, which is the prescribed EU methodology. So you can see this is how you calculate your specific embedded emissions. We have given the formula here. Due to lack of time, I just don't want to go into depth. And right now we'll be using product embedded emissions, which is complex. So we have there are some complex input materials and a complex good is coming out. So we will be using the complex product embedded emissions formula. So you can see that SEEG is a specific embedded emissions, which is direct or indirect. So you will identify your specific emissions for both direct emissions and then the indirect emissions also. So that we will find out by the attributed emissions, overall attributed emissions by your amount of goods produced, and it will also include all the precursors you have used during the manufacturing production process. So I'm moving over. And this is how we calculate the direct attributed emissions. So when you're calculating any direct attribute emissions, it is going to be directly attributable emissions linked to source streams. This will exclude waste gases and heat. Then you will also have to add your emissions related to attribution of measurable heat imported, and you will also take the emissions related to attribution of measurable heat exported. So you have to subtract them, and you also have to include corrections. So what is the correction for waste gases that you are importing during the production process, and what is going out? So that has to be subtracted, and also any emissions related to electricity that is being produced. This is just for your direct attributed emissions. This is the calculation. And then you also have indirect attributed emissions, which is nothing but your electricity consumed into the electricity emission factor. So emission factors also for electricity, you have default values, but there are cases when you have your own power. Manufacturing units can have their own power plant and then produce electricity, so they can give you their emission factor also. So moving over, and this direct emissions is based on the I'm going backwards so to help you see this. So the calculations that you're going to see is based on this specific production process, uh, sorry, which is here, crude steel production. So you will be able to see this iron ore, coke fines, coke, plastic waste, steel scrap, and all, and what comes out, and the electricity, and also waste gases out here. So I'm just brushing through this. So here is how you calculate your direct emissions. So you have your input and your activity data, that is the volume of that specific input, and how much carbon content is available in your input. So, and we have given some values here, and then how much is the emission. So you have to find the emission of each and every input by taking the activity data and multiplying it with the carbon content, and you also use a factor of 3.664. This is called a correctional factor, and then you will arrive at the emissions in tons per carbon equivalent. So this is how we find out for coke, iron ores. Then you also have coke, plastic waste, scrap, internal, external, and you can see each and every input that has gone inside the manufacturing production process with the volume. Please understand, it's going to be the input, the volume, that is the activity data, including the carbon content, because we had I had already mentioned that in certain inputs you will already have embedded emissions, so carbon content will already be there. So we have to multiply them and also use a factor, correctional factor of 3.664, which will give you the emissions here that is listed down here, and we'll have to provide the total input. So your total input comes to around this number. Excuse me. And we have also written why we are using this correctional factor. So 1 kilogram of carbon will produce 3.67 kg of carbon dioxide. So this is a correctional factor we are using in the direct emissions. Then I'm moving over. Then as we said in the during the calculation method, that we not only factor our inputs, we also have to see what comes in the output, and the difference of these two will give us the emissions. So what is your output? You have steel as your output, you have slag. So what is the volume of that, and what is the slag volume? You also have your carbon content, and then multiply them to get your total emissions. Then you have to take this total input from the previous, and then you also have your total output, and then subtract them. You will have your total emissions from the installation. This is what this is based on the attribution of the emissions to the input and attributed emissions to the output. So this will be your final figure of your emissions. And once we have arrived at that, we also saw the concept of waste gases. So we had prescribed earlier in the formula that when you want to use a direct direct emissions, when you want to find out, you also have to deduct your waste gases. So you have your net calorific value, and your emission factor is provided. You can use the default emission factors for this. This is called a, and we also use a gas correctional factor. And once you multiply them, that is like 12800 into 56.1 into 0.667, which is a gas correction factor, you will get your emissions for waste gases. So this has to be subtracted from your total emissions, and you will have your total direct attributed emissions for your crude steel process. And right now, I'm sorry. we have seen only direct emissions. We also have indirect emissions that needs to be figured out. So for indirect emissions, it's all about electricity, and there are various sources from where you may procure electricity. So for here we see in the example they have gotten 25% from the grid, and the electricity also has been produced from waste gases. So what was activity data in megawatt per hour? So you will have that data, and you have the electricity from grid. You will have a default emission factor. You can use that. If you, or else if you're going to purchase it from somebody, they can also give you an emission factor, the right emission factor. You can use that. If not available, you can use a default emission factors that is produced, that is published by IEA. And then secondly, you also have electricity from waste gases, and you also have their emissions factor, and you have to total them out, and then you multiply with your emissions factor, that is your weighted average, and you will come up with an indirect emission of this value. So I'm moving over to the next slide. So right now what we have done is we have attributed emissions, direct emissions, to the input and the output. So that is our total direct emissions that is coming out of the production process, and this is the indirect emissions. We are finding out what is the total indirect emission through electricity consumption, and then you have to know what is your yearly volume of goods activity level. So you have to also bring in the yearly volume. So what are the precursors used? So all the goods that are being produced, you will have to enter your activity level, that is your volume, in tons per year. And once you total them out, it comes to this value. And you also have scrap from your installation. You also have to have all the activity level data for the entire year. And finally, this is how you calculate your specific embedded emission. Whether this is going to be a business who's doing this, or else like this data comes from the installation or suppliers. This is one of the right approaches to have and calculating the embedded emissions. So this is your total amount of goods produced, that is your steel product. This has come from the activity level from the previous slide, and then you have your total direct emissions, which we figured out by attributing your emissions both to the input and output, subtracting them, arriving at a value. That is the value that you see here, 7387085. It's an tons of carbon dioxide per equivalent, forgive me. And then you also have the total indirect emissions of the installation, which we saw in the previous slide. And finally, you can calculate the specific direct embedded emissions by the amount of goods. So you have to divide your direct emissions by the amount of good, then the indirect emissions by the amount of good. So that will give you the specific direct embedded emissions. So it is 1.539 for direct emissions, and your indirect emissions will be 0.203, and you have your total embedded emission for steel as 1.742. And if this is going to be a manufacturing unit or facility, and they are providing steel to someone else, like to another business or an importer, so they have to arrive at this value and give the importer this value. So this is just for one good and one production process. Of course, your production process for each and every good may differ, and it may go through a different production route altogether. So based on whatever we are doing, it needs to be measured, and the volume needs to be taken care, and we have to arrive at this value so that we can give our importers the right data for a declaration. And this is just a summary. Due to the lack of time, I'm just not going to state the summary right now. I'm already past time. So here is where APA can help you. We can help you identify your Cbam scope, whether if you fall within the Cbam scope, help you with training and awareness, and validate your data. We can also catch up with your manufacturing units or facilities, and help them give you the right data if you're going to be a importer or a declarant into the EU. And we also have a software platform where we can send service to suppliers to gather the data and make your life more easier. So this is how APA can help. I've given the whole list of definitions out here, because for all the process we studied today. You can take a look at this later. We will send out the PPT to you. And these are our references from where we had this presentation. All of this has come directly from your European Union, and learning and observing and doing all the work firsthand. In case you want to reach out to us for questions, please do reach out to us at compliance@apengineering.com. You have our website, and you have our website also information with us. And in case you have any questions, please ask us. I did see a question prior, and they had asked me whether they had published the default reference values. That is why I kept insisting that JRC and EU has published the default reference values. The reference values are for the precursors or the inputs that go into your production process. They have also given the production process. They have mapped it out to a specific production process and given your default values. We will provide the link below for your reference. Thank you. Any other questions that we have? Please feel free, or else please write to us and we can get back to you.
Or actually, we have received few questions.
Thank you so much for staying with us. We will reply to your questions. I see some list of questions, but I don't want to keep all of you waiting. Thanks for joining us. Have a nice day and a pleasant weekend also. Thank you. Thank you all.